was the heart of the system. To the enslaved African, it was a symbol of his conversion from man into object. To the master, it was a routine business operation. What other practical way was there to redistribute necessary labor and set prices in a changing market? To the African, it was an event to be dreaded. An experience he knew he would undergo at least once in his lifetime, and perhaps many times. He feared the block because no matter how bad life was, it could always be worse. Only those Africans with monsters for masters were ready to take a chance on a trade.
Trade was visible everywhere in the South. Traders scoured the countryside to pick up bargains in human flesh. They hung out in taverns and general stores. They attended county fairs. They visited plantations looking for owners who needed quick cash. For estates in probation or undergoing liquidation, they put advertisements in newspapers touting the high quality and good prices of the stock they had to offer, announcing that they needed Africans to replenish their stock and would pay the highest prices. There were several dozen such operations right here in Shockoe Bottom, typically selling human goods right along with corn, coffee, and other commodities. Some sales were a part of a larger business, and other auctioneers dealt exclusively in selling Africans. White Richmonders generally ignored slave sales or accepted them as normal. The blacks that traders acquired from the surrounding countryside were brought into town and put in depots or jails to be sold privately or at public auction. The municipalities licensed the dealers and established regulations governing the trade.
This canal was renovated as a part of a downtown revitalization plan. The original canal was dug by enslaved Africans as a commercial transportation route. For an example, Virginia's cash crop, tobacco. Nearly 200 boats traverse this waterway daily. This multinational, multi-billion-dollar industry was built on the back of our ancestors' unpaid labor.
Born in Norfolk, Virginia, and I don't know who it belongs to, but I remember the day we was put on the block. I was just toddling around then, but me and my mammy sold for $1,000. My daddy, I reckon, belonged to somebody else. He was just sold away from us. Like the cows sold away from the bull.
Every town had its slave pens, many of which were vermin-infested coops, converted from vacant stables, warehouses, or backyard buildings. In the busy season, the nigger jails were jammed. The eastern and border cities gathered Africans from the backcountry and funneled them to the people who wanted them. New Orleans was the natural center for trade, flowing from the east and out to the new cotton regions. As the largest slave trading center of the Deep South, it was dotted with holding pens. A single block near the center of town held 7 depots, and in one of the squares, 11 dealers displayed their wares.
I remember seeing a heap of slave sales with the niggas in chains and speculators selling and buying them all. About the worst thing that I ever seen. Drove slaves with nothing on but a rag between their legs, being galloped around before the buyers. I also remember seeing a slave woman in Lewisburg, just been sold off from her 3 weeks old baby. She was being marched to New Orleans.
Dealers held no monopoly of the trade, however, for real estate dealers, brokers, merchants, and auctioneers added slave trading to their other business. Many small traders of this kind evolved into full-time nigger speculators. Even editors turned an honest dollar by acting as agents for those who advertised in their newspapers. There was business enough to please all. In 1830, New Orleans reported over 4,400 sales.
She had walked till she was give out. She was weak enough to fall in the middle of the road. She was chained with 20 or 30 other slaves, and they stopped to rest in the shade of a big oak while the speculators ate their dinner. The slaves ain't having no dinner.
Each pen had a turnkey on duty. His job was to oversee this human stable, receiving, feeding, and whipping Africans for so much a head per day. In good enslaved pen here in Richmond, conditions were similar, except that the yard held 2 small houses where buyers examined the Africans before concluding a bargain. There were over 30 traders right here in Richmond in the 1850s.
It was in the month of August, and the sun was bearing down hot when the slaves and their drivers leave the shade. They walked for a little peace, and this woman fall out. She dies there, side of the road. Right there, they buries her, cussing. Tells me about losing money on her.
I had noticed the bad condition of this gang several times on the road. The poor wretches being travel-worn and half-starved, and having large sores caused by their loads and the blows and cuts they received. The ropes that confined them also, in some instances, was eating into their flesh. And I saw one woman still carrying the infant that had died in her arms of starvation.
Remember, it was Virginia law that instituted the condition of bondage. Legislators were so-called Virginia gentlemen. They were planners. They were slave owners.
We've always had more slaves in Virginia than in any other North American colony or state. There were nearly 190,000 by 1776, over 350,000 by 1800, and nearly 500,000 on the eve of the Civil War. Many Africans brought into Virginia between 1619 and 1778 were uprooted violently from their African communities and transferred to the strange new world that held little or no promise for them. And we passed a statute in Virginia in 1778 that prohibited the further importation of slaves.
One might think it a benevolent act to stop importing Africans to be sold into slavery. Enough is enough. But with this law,
now Virginia's richest slaveholders could be the only slave dealers. Good evening.
The condition of bondage. And we were in it, and we also resisted it. There it was, in 34 unpublishable words. A conspirator revealed that Gullah Jack was going to give him a bottle with poison to put into my master's pump, and to as many pumps as he could about town. And he said he could give other bottles to those he could trust to. The peculiar nightmare of these peculiar masters. The court said to nothing about ambushes on arsenals, but a single domestic sneaking poison into a domesticity's water was too petrifying to broadcast. A town could guard against a surprise attack on arsenals. A modern army guarding modern firepower could crush several dozen African armed pikes. But the individual household assassin slipping something into the water was invulnerable to Denmark BC's collective vulnerability. The solitary servile hiding behind an accommodationist mask need not worry about whether pikes could conquer guns. He need have no concern about wide-eyed troops outside the slumbering house. And when his white family started dying like flies, he would be all full of weeping solicitude, full of wonder about what strange sickness ails my master's house. Couldn't hear nobody pray, I couldn't hear nobody pray, well, way down yonder by myself, but I couldn't hear nobody pray. I couldn't hear nobody pray, I couldn't hear nobody pray, well, way down yonder by myself, but I couldn't hear nobody pray. And we escaped. There are many stories of such escapes, but one some of you may be familiar with, the story of Henry Brown. It was 1849, and Henry Brown made a deal with his wife's owner that he would buy the freedom of his wife, his children, and himself. He was working hard to attain those goals. The owner reneged. Henry Brown's wife and children were sold away. She was a part of a coffin tied to other Africans being marched to further points south from Richmond. The story that you just heard of Josephine Smith, for those of you who don't know, in Lewisburg is outside of Raleigh in North Carolina. And she was being marched in a coffin to New Orleans. And as you were walking tonight, some of you might have thought you might have ended up in Georgia, which was very typical of the time. And Henry Brown held his wife's hand and walked with her as far as he was allowed. And then he could only watch her and his children walk away until they disappeared. He never saw them again. He said, "I'm out of here." He got with some fellow Africans and some abolitionists in Confederate Richmond, there were some, and made a plan to ship himself to Philadelphia and ultimate freedom. He packed himself in a box, hence his nickname, Henry Box Brown, set out on the 27-hour journey as freight. In 1847, that was no joke, to Philadelphia. Box Brown is here tonight, and we're going to go and meet him now. So follow us to see Henry Box Brown.